Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 8th GLOBALCIT webinar entitled The Citizenship, Migration and Mobility Nexus. My name is Jelena Jankic. I'm part-time professor at the Global Governance Program of the Robert Schuman Center at the EUI and co-director of the GLOBALCIT Observatory. Today, we'll explore the linkages between citizenship, migration, and mobility. And we'll ask questions such as, how and when is citizenship a powerful push and pull factor for global mobilities and migration? And also, in turn, how migratory patterns and these global mobilities affect the legal and political domains of citizenship. Tonight, we have 4 wonderful speakers with us. So it's my pleasure to introduce Yossi Harpaz, who's Assistant Professor of Sociology at Tel Aviv University, Janine De Hinden, who's Professor of Transnational Studies and the Director of Maison d'Analyse des Processus Sociaux and Project Leader in the NCCR on the Move at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. Our next speaker is Caroline Naloulé, who's a postdoctoral research fellow working on the European Research Council funded project, Refugees or Migrants, Refugee Mobility, Recognition and Rights. And finally, Diego Acosta, who's professor in European and Migration Law at the University of Bristol. Tonight's session is structured as a roundtable. We'll have 3 rounds of questions, and our speakers will have roughly 4 minutes to respond to each of the questions. After each round of questions, I will try to engage the audience, meaning that you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. To do so, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, as that will be the only possibility for you to interact with our speakers. I will read the questions, and please, in asking your question, also direct it to a particular speaker. Otherwise, I will once again use my discretion to allocate your question to one of our speakers. So without further ado, I will start the first round of questions by turning to Yossi Harpaz. So Yossi, you have previously written about strategic citizenship, and now, as of the last couple of years, you've been working on the demand for investor visas. So how do you think the citizenship of origin affects migration and mobility for the wealthy? What other push factors, in a way, can you identify as relevant, and how do they differ among different kinds of strategic citizens that you have encountered in your research?
Yeah, thanks, Jelena, and thanks for inviting me to participate. It's great to be here. So I'll first explain this concept of strategic citizenship, and then I'll answer your question. So strategic citizenship describes a situation where, like, let's say, the growing tendency to treat citizenship as an instrumental resource and like detach citizenship from its traditional association with national identity, from its sacred dimension, and treating it instrumentally. This is very common for people with dual citizenship, but there are also other formations of strategic citizenship. Since over the past 2 years, I've been working on a project on investor visas. I created a data set, trying to understand what causes wealthy individuals to invest $500,000 or $1 million, euros, in trying to get this kind of visas. And I'll just make 2 observations that pertain to your question. First of all, something that's very interesting is that we can think of citizenship, especially if it's strategic citizenship, as a form of capital. It provides, it's a resource. It provides rights, it provides security, it provides travel freedom. And of course, wealth is a form of capital. So we can think of individuals as having high or low levels in both of these resources. So what does it mean to have, for a person who is already a very wealthy individual, for a person who owns millions of dollars and euros, what is the meaning of high or low value citizenship? And high-tier citizenship, so citizenship from the EU or the US, provides personal security and security of property. but it comes with a very high level of supervision and taxation. So these citizens of these countries are relatively visible to their governments. Low-tier citizenship brings with it a lot of risks. The wealth is a risk, and the persons are at risk, but it provides some level of freedom and ability to hide one's assets and to move them around and to evade taxation. So this creates different mobility strategies where we see that elites with high-tier citizenship may potentially try to seek more freedom because they already have security, and elites with lower-tier citizenship, such as Chinese millionaires, may try to get extra security. And what we see here is that what we see when we look at the figures about actual demand for investor visas and also investor citizenship that you've studied, Yelena, is that demand for the latter is much, much bigger. So we see a lot of wealthy elites holding lower tier developing country citizenship that are trying to get this extra security through visas, through citizenship. We see relatively little demand for among wealthy elites from developed countries, from first-tier countries, trying to get this extra freedom. This is maybe the image in the newspapers, but it's actually quite rare. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Yossi. I'd like to turn to Caroline now. This is very interesting, and go and try and get a bit of a different perspective. So Caroline, has citizenship had an impact as an enabler of mobility in the East African community? And what other factors have impacted on the migration rights in this region? So I'm thinking here of the different institutional factors, such as the role of courts. You're muted.
Okay, yeah, that's corrected. So thanks so much, Yelena. Yes, you're right. Citizenship is kind of like a very big enabler for migration and mobility within the East African region. First of all, we have a free movement regime, which is kind of like just gaining traction, but at least it's a lot more advanced than other regions in Africa. And for you to be able to take full benefit of it, you have to be a citizen of a member state. So if you are not recognized, one of the stateless communities that are, we have quite a number of stateless communities within the region, or if you are from a marginalized or disadvantaged community, you are obviously excluded from that regime. So, but even more than the political citizen, I think there is greater mobility for what I call the economic citizen. Yeah, these are the people who are moving either for work or for business. So those are the ones that are really taking more advantage of this citizenship regime than any other person. So in terms of other factors that, and this may seem to contradict what I just said, in terms of other factors, of course, there is the court that is upholding the rights of free movement for citizens, even as the countries within this region have agreed to open up borders for each other's citizens, there are still some obstacles and roadblocks. So at times there are instances when they just do not want a particular political figure to get into another country or an activist, and then they'll deny them entry. And we have had the court, which is the East African Court of Justice, stepping in and kind of like upholding the rights of free movement within the region. But also something else is, even before we had this regime, we have cross-border communities, which due to the colonial history, were split up among the countries. So really for those communities, borders have never existed. They have always crossed the borders. So those strong family ties are a very strong link that kind of like, I wouldn't say undermine, but it's kind of like goes beyond the regime that we have set up for free movement. Yeah, I think then also the other reason, one thing I would like to touch upon is what you would call an institution, and I think it also dovetails a bit with what Yash just mentioned, is the free movement in the region is mainly elite-driven. It is not mainly people-driven. So it is the elites that are benefiting more from this cross-border movement or from the regime as it currently is. Yeah, I think I'll stop here for now and pass on to the next.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm fascinated by the communities that are beyond this kind of free movement regime, and it's something that we could explore further in the Q&A session. But now I'd like to briefly turn to Diego and ask about your thoughts on the role of citizenship as a mobility enabler in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Well, thanks, Jelena. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, yeah, absolutely. Citizenship is very important. Similarly to what Caroline was talking about in East Africa, because of the importance of regional free movement agreements, both in Latin America, or more in particular in South America, and also in the Caribbean. So in South America, there are different regional free movement regimes, but the most important one, perhaps the one that a lot of people already know, is the Mercosur Residence Agreement, which allows nationals, so citizens of 9 countries, 9 out of the 12 countries in South America, all of the countries in South America except for Venezuela, Suriname, and Guyana, to move and reside within the region. And according to IOM, between 2009 and 2016, there were more than 2.6 million nationals of these 9 countries in South America who had benefited from the Mercosur Residence Agreement. Of course, now when we look at South America, we have to think about the emigration of Venezuelans. Venezuelans are the second largest displacement in the world right now after Syrians. And some Venezuelans also benefit from this Mercosur Residence Agreement in Argentina, in Uruguay, and in Brazil, even though Venezuela as such is not part of this agreement. So very, very important in South America. Actually, one minor thing also to mention when it comes to Venezuelans is how Venezuelans benefit from dual citizenship when it comes to emigrating to Europe, and how the important immigration in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s from Spain, Portugal, and Italy means that there are many dual citizens in Venezuela who hold Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese nationality, and therefore they have much more opportunities to reside, for example, in Europe. I have recently met randomly a number of Venezuelans here in London, and when you ask them, all of them are either Portuguese, Italian, or Spanish, and that had obviously benefited them to a tremendous extent, right? Very briefly, when it comes to the Caribbean, it's also very interesting. They have 2 important regional organizations, CARICOM, which is perhaps better known, but CARICOM only allows for free movement of certain categories of workers. But then lesser known is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which are 6 small island states, and also Montserrat, which is an overseas territory of the UK, and what they have is free movement of workers without the need to have any kind of residence permit or work permit. They can move freely, and this is an interesting free movement regime because in some of these countries are prone to environmental disasters. We have just seen in St. Vincent and the Grenadines how there has been the eruption of a volcano, or in 2017, Dominica was heavily damaged by Hurricane Maria. And what happened after that is that citizens from these countries could move to neighboring countries, not as being so-called environmental migrants or refugees or nothing of the sort, but simply because they were regional citizens with free movement rights. And I think that is a very important lesson that perhaps could be useful also for other regions around the world.
Thank you so much, Diego. Before I hand over to Janine, I would like to remind the audience that you can already start using the Q&A function and post your questions. And after Janine, and we'll have the opportunity to perhaps address some of them. Janine, how can we address the question of the citizenship, migration, and mobility nexus without falling back to the very traditional nation-state-centric approaches?
Many thanks, Elena, and many thanks for this invitation. I think this is really an interesting round, and obviously you're asking me a very difficult question. But still, I mean, you have until now, I think most of you have been thinking of this nexus between citizenship and migration in terms of enabler, or citizenship enabling or preventing migration and mobility. And I would like to make a step back and in a complementary way introduce a slightly different lens on this migration citizenship nexus, which is also linked to the question of mobility, of course. So I think often what we observe when we talk about these issues is that we think these two categories, citizenship and migrants, as clear binaries. So it's either you're a citizen or you're a migrant, and you can change it. And of course, I mean, both categories, they are anchored in a nation state logic. I would even say that this binary citizenship versus migrant is the outcome of the logic of the nation state apparatus. So without the nation state logic, there would not be migrants in the way we understand them today, but only people on the move. And this binary distinction between migrants and citizens is, of course, also crucial, not only for the creation, but also the governance of nation states and their territorial borders, like border regime, migration and mobility regime. They are based upon actually this binary which we have. Yet I think, and here I am going back to a debate I started with Bridget Anderson, I think that we could think beyond this binary, which would also reveal some other aspects. Because Bridget Anderson actually, she started to scrutinize this binary in an article she published in 2019. And she proposed to explore the connections between formal exclusion of non-citizenship and the multiple and informal exclusion within citizenship. And she proposed that we should investigate the ways citizens might be migrantized. And we pushed this debate further because I actually argued that also migrants can be citizenized. And I'm really sorry for these terrible English words we're all the time inventing. And I think if we're going to see how are migrants citizenized and citizen migrantized, we can see new possibilities of this link to mobility. And I would like to give you very shortly 2 or 3 examples. So the most obvious, obviously, is when it comes to the migrantization of citizens, is when it comes to descendant of migrants. No, even if they are citizens, often we speak of them of second generation migrants, or in the German context of people with migration background, which of course is again linked to this nation state logic. And both categories, second generation and migration background, indicates that formal citizenship does not perfectly coincidence with symbolic membership in the citizenry. And this can have effects in terms of mobility, actually. For instance, when it comes to cross-border marriages, where I did research on. So a Swiss citizen, a second generation Swiss citizen, who will be marrying a person from the country of origin, if it's not the EU, is often confronted with the fact that civil officers will put such a marriage under the general suspect of a sham marriage, marriage of convenience, or forced marriage, which might result in the non-mobility of his partner he or she wanted to marry. So we have a kind of indirect link between citizenship and migrantized citizen and mobility. Or another very short example of migrantization of citizens. In Switzerland, where I'm working, until 1952, Swiss women who married foreigners were deprived of their citizenship. So they lost citizenship. They became foreigners. So this is also a kind of migrantization of citizenship. And in the event of illness or dependency of the welfare state, they could be deported. So this is kind of forced migration of former citizens because they kind of became migrantized. And we know, of course, this topic today, revoking citizenship, is very topical. As you all know, in the case of so-called terrorists, and some states, they really started also to do it. So again, citizens become migrants and can be deported. Or one example, how migrants can become citizenized. Like in many French-speaking cantons in Switzerland, foreigners have voting rights in cantonal and municipal elections, and sometimes also the right to hold public office at the cantonal or municipal level. So here we see that migrants get citizenized. Yet it's quite interesting, like in the canton of Neuchâtel, where my university is located, male foreigners, also migrants, gained the right to vote at the municipal level in 1849. This was revoked afterward, but reinstated in 1875. At this time, Swiss women couldn't vote. So Swiss women only obtained the right to vote in this canton in 1959 and on federal level in 1979, as you know. So basically, here, migration did lead to citizenship rights for male migrants, while women Swiss citizens did not have these rights, basically. And again, this is obviously linked to mobility and migration. And very shortly, final examples. I think there are also a lot of citizens who have restricted mobility rights, or at least their mobility is controlled, and who are, if you like, migrantized. So think of homeless people. So their mobility rights are often restricted or at least controlled by specific urban infrastructures, so that they cannot move everything and sleep everywhere. Or unemployed people, when dependent on welfare, they cannot be mobile as they have to present themselves on the employment office, etc. So let's say kind of poor people, even when citizens experience at least at times a control or even restriction of their mobility. And I think this is quite interesting because this gives us new insight into this nexus between citizenship and mobility if we go beyond the category of migration as a cross-border movement, but if we also include other forms of mobility, which I think allows us to kind of complement this nexus with a, obvious, of course, more microsociological perspective. And I stop here, finally.
Thank you so much, Janine. I think you've given us quite a lot of food for thought, and also mentioned and highlighted one of the very important aspects of the whole debate, which is the gender issue, which is often neglected in the discussion of citizenship, migration, and mobility. And I would just like to give the opportunity to our speakers to address some of the questions that we have received from our audience, and I'll keep some for the end. So Joe Shaw is asking a question which is directed to Diego and Caroline. And she says that free movement was a negative factor in the context of the Brexit referendum, partly because it was seen as an elite matter. So if free movement regimes are also benefiting elites in places such as Latin America and East Africa based on access to citizenship, might there be a backlash against this? And in relation to this, I'll also ask you to address the question that Martin Vink posed, which is, in Europe, there's a lot of debate about contradictions between internal freedoms for privileged persons, but stricter external border regimes for outsiders, including spillover to remote control policies in the neighborhood. Can you see also some of these dynamics in East Africa or Latin America? So I think I will start by asking Caroline to address these questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. I think they are very kind of like, yeah, they provoke a very good debate. To answer the first question, I think I'll say yes. Yeah, there is a possibility of that backlash, and already we see it because let me just give you the context. Within the East African community, there are 6 member countries. So that's Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, which is half in, half out until it stabilizes. So I'll give examples mainly of the 5 countries. So as we talk of free movement of persons, we are all at different paces of that. So you have Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda moving much faster in that direction than the other 2 countries, partly because of maybe political will or suspicion among the countries that maybe these citizens will come in and take over. So there is that potential of backlash, but that is really at the high level, at the political level, it's being politicized. But at the grassroots level, it's a different story, because these are people that, like I said, some of them, they have always been crossing the borders freely. And actually, one of my fears is that this free movement regime may actually have overregulated what has been a non-regulated area before for them. So there is a potential for backlash, but yeah, on both sides, we can, at the higher level, yes, but on the ground level, probably, yeah, less so. And then to respond to the second question, if I can recall what it was, yeah, about stricter border controls for, of course there are, yeah, there are, like I said, we are still treating each other with mutual suspicion. So, and also within the regulations themselves, you see that if you compare with the EU, for example, we still have border checks, which is not existing in the EU. We still have limitations on where someone can reside when they are coming in under that regime of same free movement of workers or under the right of establishment. So there are still those restrictions towards outsiders than towards insiders. So I think that briefly answers the question. If it hasn't, I am willing to elaborate on it more. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Caroline. Diego.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think in the case of South America, it's not so much a backlash against those who are seen as elites or privileged. It is actually a matter of a huge pressure that has resulted from the emigration of Venezuelans. So as I mentioned earlier, Venezuelans are not part, or Venezuela is not part of the Mercosur Residence Agreement, but it applies in certain countries, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and before it also applied in Ecuador under a different framework, but domestically in 2017, in the new immigration law in Ecuador, they decided that all South Americans, so including also Venezuela, Suriname, and Guyana, will have the right to enter, reside, work, be treated equally with nationals in Ecuador. And following the arrival of an important number of Venezuelans to Ecuador, Ecuador is the 4th largest recipient of Venezuelans. What has happened in 2020 is that chapter of the immigration law in Ecuador has been deleted. So now there is no chapter in the immigration law about free movement of South Americans. So they go back to only implementing the Mercosur Residence Agreement as it was before, which means that Venezuelans are out of the scope. And we can also mention, for example, Chile, which has now adopted the new immigration law, and I was part of different debates there last year. And there was a lot of debate on whether Venezuelans could be included in the law as regional migrants and as being part of this Mercosur Residence Agreement, because Venezuelans are the largest number of non-nationals in Chile, and therefore this will solve their legal status. But in the end, there was a lot of traction in favor of that option, but in the end, that option was not adopted in the migration law in Chile. So it's a little bit more complex in that regard, also because the origins of the Mercosur Residence Agreement does not have to do with free movement of workers or with economic integration, but rather have to do with solving the issue of undocumented migration in South America. So how to regularize those who were already there. And obviously the emigration of large numbers of Venezuelans changed completely the scenario. And regarding Martin's question, yes, absolutely. This is debated at 2 levels, perhaps. So the first level is that and many scholars are very aware of the fact that there is a possibility or a danger of creating a two-tier, so two different types of categories, right? Like in the EU citizens versus third country nationals. That could also happen, or that is already happening at the level of the law in South America, and there is a lot of willingness there for that not to happen, at least at the level of academic discussions. And it is interesting how in some rulings by domestic courts, you see how they do not use regional free movement agreements in order to argue in favor of rights for individuals, but they rather use more universal human rights instruments deriving from the UN, so the UN Migrant Workers Convention and others, which I find very, very interesting. So I think that is an important element. And then, you know, at the level, obviously, what happens when people move between regions, where we can see, for example, Venezuelans moving to countries in the Caribbean as well. Trinidad and Tobago is the most important recipient, or one of the most important recipients, and actually the most important recipient per capita in terms of the number of nationals in Trinidad and Tobago versus the number of Venezuelans arriving. And obviously Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago do not have any privileged status and are actually treated as irregular migrants, and in many cases are expelled, and they have a very hard time accessing basic rights there. So that tension is also present there.
Thank you so much, Diego. I will briefly ask Yossi a question that we got from an anonymous attendee before, again, continuing to ask him questions from our second round. Thomas Frank, in his book, The Empowered Self, considers our age as age of individualism with new climate of personal freedom. He believes that individuals are increasingly choosing the components of their identity. What do you think in this regard? Can we argue that second citizenship choices are able to provide new aspects of individualism and freedom of choice for different individuals? Yossi.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so absolutely. All of these phenomena that we've been talking about, I mean, dual citizenship, ancestry-based dual citizenship that Diego mentioned, and to a lesser extent, but still also residence visas for sale or citizenship for sale. And I would say even some of the way that people use these free movement options that exist both in the EU and in other regional areas, they all of them work in different ways, some subtle, some not so subtle, as dual citizenship, to undermine this traditional construction of citizenship and nationality as a sacred, unitary component in individual identity. Like, we can think about it as the question of what is superior ontologically, what precedes what. The nation is before the individual, and the individual is obliged to give total loyalty and devotion to the nation, which is kind of like the traditional, caricaturized, but still pretty real view of nationality, which is expressed in laws that require single nationality. Also in the examples that Janine mentioned about the Swiss women, for example, and what we see through these different laws and different possibilities and strategies for individuals, we see an opportunity for individuals to put themselves ontologically above or before the nation and kind of create for themselves a set of practical options that also translates into a set of individual self-understandings and practices.
And just to continue in this vein and start with the second round of questions, which is also related to some of the questions we got in the Q&A section. So I'll ask them after this round. So different migrant trajectories often result in different migration rights, right? So what do you see as the main challenges for the strategic citizens in terms of political membership? Are there, and normatively, should there be different differences and different approaches, different rights for the different types of citizens and migrants?
Okay. So So, I mean, so when we're talking about strategic citizens or people who are getting a second visa, so we see that in most cases, their motives are instrumental. They might be about reducing risk, which is a huge thing. They might be about looking for opportunities, which is another big motive. Some sort of subjective components, such as seeking a status symbol, or even making some kind of identity statement. In any case, it is only in a minority of cases that people that seek this kind of strategic citizenship are making a step that can be compared to an immigrant naturalizing in the country, giving up their original citizenship, and fully embracing this country as like a community of faith, you know, this expression from study of nationalism. So in this sense, if by political community, what we're talking about is voting, and specifically overseas voting. I mean, you know, if I take your question and I change it into a question about overseas voting, then obviously the rise of all of these flexible and overlapping memberships, it creates a lot of potential for overseas voting for people who are not very strongly connected to the countries where they can vote, like these Portuguese or Italians that Diego mentioned. Even before they left Venezuela, they could still vote in elections in Italy, and now when they live in the UK, they can still vote in elections in Italy. So there is something that is potentially problematic about it. And I'll say two things about it. One, this kind of, it kind of breeds opportunism. It creates a lot of opportunities for opportunism on both sides. On the side of the individuals, it's obvious why this could be opportunistic, because people would vote based on their own, not necessarily thinking about the good of the residents of the country, but about their own interest. For example, maybe there's a candidate that's offering some benefits to the diaspora, so they would vote for them. It's also opportunistic from the side of the country that's granting these rights. Very famously, this was, we have the case of Hungary, where Orban gave out citizenship to more than 1 million people out of the ethnic Hungarians living outside Hungary, out of a clear expectation that they would vote for him. And indeed, 95% of those who voted in 2014 voted for Fidesz, for his party. So we do see this kind of opportunism. However, I would also like to note that it's very fleeting, this kind of rights, because it doesn't deal with the voting rights of citizens that are in the territory, that can protest, that can organize demonstrations, that can show up at whatever, the city hall. It's very easy to revoke this right through all sorts of administrative means. So when governments, and this has happened in several Central Eastern European countries, when governments don't want voters, overseas voters from a specific area to vote, they just can, not open many options for them to vote, and then they can wait in line for 10 hours. This happened in Romania, for example. Romanians are voting from Western Europe, Hungarians the same, or they can completely eliminate their right to vote, such as, if I'm not mistaken, Croatia said, like, non-resident citizens can no longer vote from Bosnia and Herzegovina. They have to come to the territory of Croatia if they want to vote. So it's just a note that there is a lot of potential for opportunism, but there is also, it's not a reliable basis for political membership, this kind of transnational political ties. I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you so much, Yossi. So I would like to turn to Caroline and ask you, what do you see as the main challenges for refugees versus other categories of migrants in the East African community? And for instance, in terms of political membership, but also I would like to add to this Rainer Baubach's question, who asked you, in East Africa, what would be the conditions for allowing stateless communities to benefit from pre-movement provisions?
Ooh, okay. That's a double-barreled question. So let me, I'll tackle the one for refugees first. Sadly, I think the East African community has not yet come around to discuss or with a strategy on how to deal with refugees. So it just has a statement, I think, in the treaty, if I'm not mistaken, that they are still handed under the different national laws, according to the different national laws. So what that means in real terms is that once you have the label of a refugee, regardless of where you're coming from, it tends to stick and follow you wherever you go. Yeah. So in this kind of the border crossings, if you don't have the documentation of the state to which you belong, it's going to be very difficult for you. But even if you manage to go into the another member state, you are going to be considered under the refugee regime rather than the free movement regime. Yeah. So in that instance, you're not different from any other refugees, and you are so different from those who come in under the free movement regime. So what happens that refugees will be taken care of by the humanitarian organizations, yet had you come in as a citizen and been recognized as an East African citizen, you would have been catered for under the East African community provisions. But currently in the community law, there are no provisions for that. So sadly, refugees still remain refugees. Then remind me again the question on stateless communities?
What would be the conditions for allowing stateless communities to benefit from free movement provisions in East Africa? Yeah,
I think that the straightforward way for that is for states to recognize them as part of, because they are not going away. They are there to stay. They have been there for years and years. So states just have to recognize them. And now that most of the states within the region are rolling out an identification project, some people are taking advantage of that. And there are some states that have come out to say that, okay, people who have been in the country for more than 25 years plus, they can apply for citizenship or be naturalized as citizens. So I think that is the way to go for states to recognize these communities and give them the opportunity to register as citizens, formal citizens. Because why that is so important is because unlike other economic communities within Africa, the East African community is explicitly aspiring towards a political federation. So it's going to have to address the city of citizenship head on at some point, and these are some of the issues that it will have to address. So stateless communities will have to be kind of like brought into the community as well, because they're citizens of the community. They don't belong to any other community apart from that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. So Diego, again, the same question. What do you see as the main challenges for refugees and other categories of migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean? And also, again, to that, I would add Rainer's question, which essentially asks whether there could be some travel documents that would facilitate free movement in this region. So whether these could, whether people could benefit from these arrangements.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, I think going back to the example that I was using earlier of Venezuelans, I think the key question that has been debated in the last 3-4 years in South America, but also in other countries in more at large in Latin America and the Caribbean, is whether Venezuelans are migrants, whether they are regional citizens, or whether they are refugees. And the reason why Venezuelans could be considered as refugees is because in the Latin American context, we have the Cartagena Declaration. For those who don't know what the Cartagena Declaration is, very briefly, it is a non-legally binding declaration adopted in 1984, which expands the scope of who is to be considered as a refugee. So it's much more, it's much wider than the Geneva Convention, and basically considers as refugees also those who are fleeing their country because their lives, their safety or freedom has been threatened by generalized violence, or by foreign aggression, or by internal conflicts, or by massive violations of human rights, or by any other circumstances which have gravely disturbed the public order. And the interesting thing about the Cartagena Declaration is that it began as a non-legally binding instrument, but it very quickly or over the years, it gained traction by being enshrined domestically in the legislations of 15 countries in the region, which have incorporated this definition of who is a refugee also into their asylum and refugee laws. The main challenge there is that the difference between the law on the books and the law in action is absolutely huge, because you can see governments in certain countries, again, going back to the Chilean example I mentioned earlier, saying that there are massive violations of human rights in Venezuela, but at the same time not granting refugee status to Venezuelans under their own refugee law, which says that if you are living, if you are fleeing a country where there are massive violations of human rights, you are to be considered as a refugee. And the only country, perhaps paradoxically, that has granted refugee status to an important number of Venezuelans by using this definition, this expanded definition of the Cartagena Declaration, is Brazil. And I say paradoxically because Bolsonaro has been very vocal in his opposition to migration and to migrants' rights. Actually, Brazil has not endorsed or initially endorsed, but then left the Global Compact on migration. But nonetheless, in Brazil, we have 50,000 Venezuelans who have been granted refugee status under this expanded definition of the Cartagena Declaration. So in Brazil, it's an interesting case because you have Venezuelans who are treated as regional citizens and are granted a residence permit as regional citizens. But at the same time, you have Venezuelans who are treated as refugees and who are granted a residence permit as refugees. And going back to, I'm going to Reiner's question about, I was reading also in the chat that he was interested about to what extent countries could give residence rights based on regional agreements to third country nationals, because I was mentioning the examples of Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, and how they treat Venezuelans as regional citizens, even though Venezuela has not ratified this Mercosur residence agreement, and even though Venezuela is now suspended from the Mercosur membership. And I think that is a very interesting case, because it also shows that in order to grant free movement rights, reciprocity is not always a sine qua non condition. And that contradicts some arguments made by scholars saying, well, free movement only works when you have reciprocity. Well, that is not the case in these examples that I'm mentioning in South America, because Brazilians, Argentinians, and Uruguayans do not have the right to enter, reside, and work in Venezuela. Not that they will go now, but they didn't have that right earlier either. So I think that is an interesting example of how countries can sometimes use a pragmatic approach in their responses to particular situations that they face when it comes to human mobility.
Thank you so much, Diego, and thanks to all the speakers. So we've seen a very empirical perspective. We've seen what happens in the different corners of the world and with different strategies of obtaining citizenship and migrating. So now I would like to turn to Janine and ask you, how can we speak about this differentiation between citizens and migrants? When we do that, we obviously categorize, and thus we try or risk the failing into essentialism. How can reflexivity help us to avoid reductionism and this essentialization, if you wish, in studying migration, mobility, and citizenship?
Thank you, Elena. Again, a big question, but I think it depends a lot how we deal with categories. And you might think I'm obsessed with categories. Yes, I'm a social anthropologist, that we are obsessed, but I also do other things. But still, let's stick to the categories for now. And I think as researchers, we are all confronted with the same dilemma, that categories are problematic, yet we do need them in everyday life as much as in social science, because it's neither possible nor desirable to avoid categorization. If we do social research, then we just can kind of stop doing our research. And I think this critique of essentialization or of these problematic forms of categorization is not about the use of categories, but it is, as you say, about the unreflective use of social categories which runs the risk, I would say, to reproduce political and normative categories and hence also hegemonic forms of exclusion. And to me, it's always quite useful, I would say, that I think about, okay, how can we understand how categories work? And I think there are at least 3 characteristics of categories which I found important. They are perspectival, political, and they have a performative character. So why are they perspectival? I would say it's impossible to assign persons to a true category, because categorization derives always from a specific social position, from historically determined ways of interpreting the world, and from particular interest. So if we speak, you cannot put people in the box, and this is exactly the debate we have here. So are they now considered as refugees? Are they now considered as free movers? I think there we see that there are perspectival, these categories, and of course also political, and always embedded in historical contexts. And I think this is quite important because we have categories like refugees or like undocumented migrants or citizens that we always ask ourselves, how did they emerge, the categories, and what do they mean, and how are they filled, and can we put people into this, and what are the political consequences basically of these categorizations, which are the actors which are involved in this kind of categorizations. And I think interesting is also that categories are always performative and they circulate. No, they always have particular meanings. This is as much a case for social science categories as for policy categories. And this means also that basically sometimes you have categories which come out of social science who are appropriated by other people in everyday life. Think of the notion of diaspora or culture or refugee. And sometimes it works differently. We had migration policy and all of a sudden a lot of researchers doing research on migration. But I think the important thing is for me is that when we have debates like this, and I mean, basically we all doing this, that we try to understand these perspectives, these social positions, also the situatedness of categories. And when we use notions like expats, refugees, asylum seeker, migrants, etc. And then I think it's quite interesting, like, because then we can also really think about the political consequences, because also these people who are classified as refugees maybe, or as economic migrants, often their migration experience does not correspond obviously to this kind of category, and they will appropriate strategies in order maybe to change the category they are classified by external people or actors or states or policies. So I don't think it's just a problem of essentialization. I think it's rather a problem of how do we use categories, and are we interested in this political, perspectival and performative character of categories. And I stop here.
Thank you so much, Janine. This was really, really interesting. So in the interest of time, I will continue with the 3rd round of questions. And after that, I will ask you a couple of questions that we have received from the audience. And I hope that we will manage to address at least some of them. So I'll start again with Yossi Harpas. And my question is, what would be the best mechanisms to ensure a balance in the distribution of rights for citizens and migrants? And let's think about the post-pandemic context. So would this pandemic be an opportunity or in a way a challenge? And what mechanisms of regional or global governance do you think could be beneficial for this? Yossi, you're muted.
Sorry, yes, okay. I lost the mute button. Yeah, so yeah, interesting question. So obviously the pandemic increases disparities, both between rich and poor individuals or families. And of course, a lot has been written about this. This is quite obvious. Those who can work from home those who own assets and so on. And also now increasingly between citizens of developed and developing nations, now that the vaccines have been rolling out and so on. So obviously the disparities are growing in the pandemic. How can we reduce them? So probably the most important thing is already happening, which is providing vaccines to as many people as possible, including in developing countries. This is obviously the most important thing that responds specifically to the pandemic. About the more general response, I don't have my own normative idea, but I would like to direct, to direct people's attention and to note that the Biden administration is now formulating a new tax policy, and we still don't know all the details, but I think it's going to have a very, very dramatic impact on citizenship, residence, visas, migration, transnational investment. A lot of things are going to be very strongly affected by this. So basically they want to increase the tax brackets, and they want to create much stricter systems of monitoring and supervision to make it almost impossible for wealthy Americans and for firms to transfer some of their assets or their profits abroad to minimize taxes. And let me just remind you that in 2010, the Obama administration created the FATCA law, which basically really forced foreign banks to report the assets of American citizens. This had a very big impact. Many banks in Europe, for example, they won't open bank accounts for American citizens. Many thousands of Americans have renounced their American citizenship following FATCA because they wanted to avoid the tax liabilities that come with American citizenship. This connects to my comment from before about how high-value citizenship also comes with a very serious obligation of relatively strict state supervision. So we can start thinking about the implications that this would have. Is this going to create a second huge wave of wealthy Americans renouncing US citizenship, like what we've seen right after FATCA? This might be even bigger. Again, by the way, the key issue is not income, it's assets. It's the taxation on assets, and it's the estate tax. So this is one question. Perhaps the world of citizenships by investment and the world of residence visas is going to start to be dominated by Americans rather than Chinese, which are currently, Chinese dominate the residence visas, and Middle Easterners and Russians dominate the citizenship by investment world. Maybe American millionaires are going to come into this field with great force following this taxation after they give up their citizenship. And of course, another very relevant question, are there going to be more countries that adopt these systems of overseas reporting and taxation? In a way, the Americans with FATCA already created a kind of basis of reporting, that if the EU or some EU countries would want to start taxing their citizens, or at least requiring some kind of increased levels of reporting, in some ways the infrastructure and the precedents are already there. So I think the US tax policy, this is one of the main things that is going to affect economic and political and citizenship disparities in the years to come. How exactly, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be important.
Yes, these are indeed times in which no one can be certain of anything. But just to turn to Caroline, what do you see as the best mechanisms to ensure the protection of rights of migrants in Africa in the post-pandemic context? And especially, do you see any regional or global governance mechanisms that would facilitate this?
Well, of course, the pandemic surely did throw a spanner in the works, for sure. It halted the progress that has been made in this area of free movement of persons. So we had borders closing to even those that go through the formal processes of it. And ironically, for those that have always been crossing the borders, they still continue to do so. So I think and yet those are the people that the community is not really looking at yet, according to me, or the way I see it, they are the nucleus for the aspirations of the community on free movement. So I think it's time for the community to look at these people, the cross-border communities, the nomadic pastoralists, those ones that have always been freely moving in the region, and there are lessons to learn from them, and how do we kind of like carry on what it is that they have always been doing. And that brings me also to the bigger point is that I think we need to kind of like bring down the application or the people currently targeted under the East African community to the grassroots and make it people driven rather than elite driven. So that's why I think that these communities that have always been crossing, they are kind of a nucleus to me, and states need to kind of like bring it down to that level so that all of us can become influence the policies that are emanating from this East African community. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Diego?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think well, there are three elements to mention moving from the global into the domestic. So at the global level, obviously, we have the compacts, and the compacts will be as important or not as domestic as what domestic actors make of the compacts themselves, right? And I think one important thing that I have seen, at least at the level of Latin America, is how there has been an emergence of many different actors involved on migration beyond government officials. So we have more and more academics, also courts, as Caroline was mentioning before, adopting important rulings. We have civil society, and that means that there are more actors involved in that conversation, and possibly that is useful for trying to engage with some of these, for example, 23 objectives in the Global Compact on migration. Then moving from the more global to the regional, I would say that obviously we know that in many regions, most migration is actually regional, and therefore protecting these regional free movement regimes, to which Caroline is referring in East Africa, or the ones that I have mentioned for South America or the Caribbean, is very, very important in this particular context. And then moving into the domestic, I think pragmatism is very important. So perhaps, and I am anticipating some of the questions that I have seen also in the chat, but we can see that during the COVID pandemic, countries have not necessarily moved in the direction of further restriction. And there, I think it's very important to mention the example of Colombia. Colombia has, even if Colombia has not granted refugee status to Venezuelans, which they could have very well done under its asylum law, Colombia has now adopted a 10-year residence permit for Venezuelans. 10-year is something that I have never seen before when it comes to granting a sort of temporary status, humanitarian status / regularization, because it also at the same time regularizes around 1 million Venezuelans in Colombia. And more importantly, what Colombia has done is to offer that residence permit to those Venezuelans who also arrive in the next 2 years. And that is a huge exercise in pragmatism. And I think that sends also a good signal that, countries are, even under the huge and dramatic situation of COVID, are not necessarily moving in more restrictive ways. So I think, again, pragmatism in how to better answer to challenges related to mobility is a very important element to consider for the future. And the Colombian example, I think, is a very important one, considering that close to 2 million Venezuelans have arrived to Colombia in around 5 years. So it puts Colombia really at the center of one of the most important immigration countries in the world, not only regionally.
Thank you so much, Diego. And I turn to Janine for another big question, which is how the pandemic has affected our approaches to citizenship, migration, and mobility. Has this major crisis brought us closer to or further away from transnational or even a global perspective in understanding the links between people and places?
Thanks again for this question, which I think is interesting. And I have been thinking how to answer, but actually I think what has been shown is that we have a kind of clash. On the one hand, I think what we saw is that social scientists, we have been quite well equipped with our concept to make sense very fast of what happened during the pandemic. From the beginning, when it comes to mobility and migration, this kind of also the reinforcement of inequalities, etc. And from the beginning, in my eyes, social scientists and particular migration scholars started to write blogs even before they had studies, but really pointing to these very problematic aspects which we all observed, being the rise of nationalism, a kind of migrantization of European citizen regime or whatsoever. And on the other hand, I think social scientists haven't been heard in public. And I'm not someone who is always complaining we are not heard. So just to make this clear, but I really feel like there was a clash or a rupture between what was going on in policy and politics and the knowledge which was produced and still is produced actually by migration scholars. And I found it quite interesting because I think it's, of course, it's problematic, but also I felt it much stronger than at other times, because maybe also because migration scholars from the beginning, they really kind of started to publish things. Or if you look at national task forces, I think most of the country have this kind of COVID-19 national task force where you have scientists. In Switzerland, there is one expert group where you have some social scientists or legal scholars. All others are public health kind of specialists. And I mean, just now, a year into the pandemic, we see very clearly the socioeconomic and social effects of this pandemic, be it in terms of raising inequalities, be it also related to migration and mobility issues. And I was quite impressed actually from the beginning by many things I have been reading also. And that's why I say I think we have been quite well equipped with our concepts to understand what's going on, not only in a transnational, but also a global perspective, basically. And I found this quite interesting, but I'm a bit stuck because I really think there is we should try to communicate here, or it might be difficult because it's quite radical what we see, I would say, what's going on during the pandemic, and also the legacies we will have of this pandemic in terms of migration and mobility, at least in Europe. I cannot pronounce myself for other areas. So this is probably not the answer you expected, but this was what came to my mind actually when I was thinking about your question.
Thank you so much, Janine. I think it's important also to start the conversation between disciplines and also amongst us about what's going on and how the pandemic will affect also the different regions in the world. And now I'd like to go and open the floor to the questions from our audience. So please, unless you have done that already, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A section. And I would like to turn back to one of the questions that we have received during the last two rounds of this roundtable. And the question is for Yossi. And I see it as a sort of a big question, which draws together your earlier work on strategic citizenship, but also your current reflections on the future of investor citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. So the question from Maria Oliveira is, how do you see the future, the place and weight, and we can discuss what these essentially mean as terms, of nationality in practical terms? Yes.
Wow, yeah, it is a very big question. So I would say, and this is of course based on the research of many people in this panel and also in the audience that I saw in the list of participants who have been studying these topics and have been writing about these topics. What we can say, I mean, one trend that seems to be quite clear is that nationality is getting, I mean, let's say one trend is it's becoming flexible. Second trend is it's becoming more and more closely associated with economic ability, wealth, and income. Future nationality, yeah. I mean, I would think one of probably the biggest trend that we would see continue going is the growing connection of nationality and income or wealth. So this would mean opening up more avenues for converting money into citizenship or visas that can lead to citizenship, and an increased attention on both on the individual actors level and also on a more public view of the monetary value of citizenship, like looking at citizenship as one of the forms of capital that people may acquire. And this is something that again, the pandemic has increased, has heightened, because the pandemic is heightened both because of the growing economic disparities and of course the economic crisis that followed, that came along with the pandemic, hit people with lower incomes much worse. And also because of the mobility restrictions. Just anecdotally from Israel, people who have, people in Israel, Jewish people in Israel can get all sorts of ancestral passports, not only from Central and Eastern European countries, but also from Spain and Portugal, where you don't even have to be from Spain. I mean, your ancestors in the 15th century had to have been expelled from Spain or Portugal. So that's about half the Israeli population. It's a relatively expensive citizenship to process, so not that many people have done it. And it looks, I mean, you know, people didn't think about it in practical terms. Once the COVID crisis started, those who had European passports could travel to Europe, and those who did not have it were unable to travel because of mobility restrictions. So suddenly, even for people who are not necessarily globe-trotting elites, this has become very, very concrete, the kind of association between citizenship and mobility, which indirectly connects to association between citizenship and income, social class, and so on, because especially if we're talking about the case of Portuguese citizenship in Israel, it's just about money. The thing that separates half the population from getting Portuguese citizenship is just who is willing to spend 2,000 or 2,500 euros on getting this citizenship, because the eligibility is very, very wide. So this is just a small example about mostly middle-class individuals, but the same logic we can see also when we think about elite individuals and when we think about middle-class people in other countries. The association between citizenship, mobility, and wealth and income is becoming stronger, and the kind of demand for conversions between them and openings for conversions between them is growing, and I predict that it will continue to increase, because it kind of serves the interests of both granting states who are trying to draw in some investment and the individuals who are seeking this kind of citizenship.
Thank you, Yossi. That's a very interesting view. I'm personally not sure if I would agree with it, as you know, but it's interesting to see reflection on the impact also of the pandemic and the salience or an increased salience of wealth in the relationship with citizenship. I would now like, because there's a very interesting question, or actually two questions, one by Szabolcs Pogoni and another one by Myra Waterbury. So Szabolcs has asked us something that has to do with categories. So he asks whether refugee rights can be discussed along with the rights of migrants, and isn't there an important normative difference between these two groups that affect access to citizenship? Also, Myra Waterbury asks about the constraints on mobility that are related to the pandemic and to what extent this rebounding of borders should endure. So I'd like to turn to Janine with these two questions, starting from the normative one and perhaps about the different ways in which we could think and rethink the different categories of analysis that we use.
Well, thanks for this question. And I mean, there is a huge discussion, at least among certain scholars, if we should use the terms refugee and migrant in the same way, or are refugees also migrant or not? And I think here we clearly see that we have different policy regimes behind, of course, because refugees, it's the Geneva Convention, is related to certain rights, to certain duties of the state. While migrants, you don't really have this kind of rights behind. I mean, you have some rights, but not all. And the question then becomes, of course, do we need refugee studies and do we need migration studies? Or are we, again, basically reproducing the political normative way? And I don't think we can give one answer on this, which would be yes or no, it's good or bad. But I think these are actually quite important reflections we need to do when we do migration research, of course. And I think the other question is, it's also interesting because what we saw is not just a restriction of mobility, but it was a new form or reinforced form of filtering the borders, I would say. And often this filtering, at least in Europe, occurred actually for nationalist purposes. So mobility was unequal, it's clear, but you had some people who could circulate. Business people could circulate, attending conferences was actually possible for quite some time in Europe. You had all those people who came to be labeled as essential key workers, which basically also could circulate, mostly nurses, which have been needed, of course, in the hospitals where the own nationals didn't have nurses anymore. And you had a lot of like male agricultural workers. I don't know if you remember this debate about the import of Romanians and Bulgarians to Germany via special flights to harvest asparagus for low wages. So, I mean, we had basically, I don't think it wasn't just a border closing. It was really a new form of filtering of borders, which was in line, I think, with this increased nationalist way and nationalism we have been observing, at least in Europe. And I think these are interesting questions because we then can ask what will be the legacies in longer term, basically. I mean, Jelena, you talked about post-pandemic times. I always think, well, we are not really there yet, but I think this kind of border closure, of border filtering, which really brought up again this kind of nationalist logic we have behind these border regimes, it will have some legacies. And the question is, what will they be? I mean, I think there's not a question I can answer, but I think this is interesting to investigate. And in case phase 3 of the NCCR will pass, this is exactly a question we would like to do, actually. What are the legacies of the pandemic in terms of bordering and boundary work and digitalization when it comes to mobility and migration?
Thank you so much, Janine. This is wonderful. And I would turn to Caroline and Diego with a question from Francesca Strumia, to which I would add a small question this time, let's hope, of my own. So Francesca asks, to what extent do the practices that you've considered portray the use of citizenship really as an enabler of mobility rather than as a pre-authorization to resettlement? Do these practices challenge the state's ability to control mobility, or do they reinforce it? And my little addition, again, to this question would be similar to what Myra Waterbury has asked. do you expect the borders that have been reinforced during pandemic times to persist, and if so, in what form? Caroline.
Thank you. I think I'll take the last question first. So I think when it comes, one thing we may not forget, and this is speaking specifically for the East African communities, first and foremost, it was an economic project. So I think to answer the question of rebounding the borders, it will be a question of cost and benefit, yeah? Is it beneficial to close them, or is it going to cost the government? I think that will be the determining factor, but I really don't see the borders being closed as they have. Once we get out of this, I don't think that they will continue with some of these restrictions that have been put in place. And then the second question on practices challenging the state ability to control mobility. In a way, I say, yes, they do challenge the state ability to control mobility. And how we see that is that once states agreed to let people freely move, the people are ready and willing, enthusiastic to exercise that right. So now for the state to come in and stop that right, it triggers a number of actions against the state and puts the state in kind of a bad light. So it has in a way empowered the people to demand more from the state, probably more than the state expected that it should be. But also in a way it is I would also think to an extent, it's reinforcing the state's position, because first of all, and this is really contextual to the region I'm speaking about, is by the time these conventions these treaties came into place, most of the countries did not have like a national identification documents. So most of us, the movement was restricted unless you could afford a passport, yeah? So, but it has also kind of like pushed states to roll out identification documents. And in a way, it is only those that can access that, that process or access those documents that can. So in a way, it's still putting the state in that position of controlling who can and who cannot move. So those that cannot access the documentation or the processes of getting those documentations, they are still kind of like excluded. So I hope that partly answers the question.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And the same question to Diego. So to what extent do the practices that you portrayed the use of citizenship as an enabler of mobility rather than a pre-authorization for settlement? And do they challenge the state's ability to control mobility, or do they reinforce it? And again, the question of borders in South America and the Caribbean, and what do you expect to happen with the borders that have been erected during the pandemic, in what I, Janine, really hope will happen one day at the post-pandemic times?
Well, thank you. Well, regarding Francesca's question, I think in the context of South America, the question will be, or not only in the context of South America, I would say in any context, is whether the state actually controls mobility to begin with, right? Because we know states do not have the capacity to control mobility, and that is why you know, individuals find different ways to have their own migration trajectories, many times by starting that migration trajectory in a regular manner, then falling into irregularity, then moving back into obtaining a residence permit, etc. Right? So, so in that context, I think in moving that idea of to what extent the state controls mobility to the South American context, mobility already happened before the adoption of regional free movement regimes. And I would perhaps disagree slightly there with Caroline, in the sense that up until the movement of Venezuelans, we didn't see South Americans necessarily moving more within South America, which is similar to what we have in Europe, right? The puzzle for the European Commission is not why EU citizens move, but rather the opposite, why EU citizens don't move to other countries in the EU when they have the rights to do so, why not a larger number of EU citizens move. And that is similar in other regions. I don't think we see an increase unless, you know, you find a situation like the one in Venezuela now, where people are living, or where people have been living because of a very particular and dramatic socioeconomic situation, political, etc., right? So in the context of South America, I think it is important to understand that people have already moved, and that is why the objective of the regional free movement regime to begin with was not to necessarily facilitate mobility, but rather to grant rights to those who were already residing there, who were undocumented in many circumstances, and as a result of being undocumented, had a harder access to certain rights. And that is that difference in the origins of the free movement regimes, I think, is very important. As to your question, Yelena, as to what is going to happen in the future, I think is a very difficult question to answer, to be honest. What we see, as I mentioned, when it comes not so much to borders, but when it comes to migration policies, what we see are, you know, countries moving in a more restricted direction, as I mentioned, for the example of Ecuador, countries opening avenues for access to residence for non-nationals, as I mentioned in the example of Colombia. We see also militarization of borders happening, for example, in Peru. We see other countries trying to open, again, residence paths for certain non-nationals, sometimes contradictorily, because, for example, in the Dominican Republic, we have at the same time the opening of certain paths for Venezuelans, but also the closing of paths for Haitians, or for actually Dominicans who were deprived of their Dominican citizenship because they were of Haitian descent. So I think the trends are very, I would say it's very, very difficult at this point to offer a general trend happening in both Latin America and the Caribbean. But I think we have to be optimistic. We have not only to concentrate on those examples which are a little bit more restrictive, but also look at those examples where we can see some reasons for optimism.
Thank you so much. I just would like to have a quick follow-up on this issue of borders, and it's going to be a final follow-up with Caroline, who mentioned the pastoral communities who have been who've never stopped, in a way, crossing borders even during the pandemic. So what can we learn? And the thing that I thought about when you mentioned it were the Maasai communities, which I've seen cross the border between Kenya and Tanzania, as if those borders were actually not existing in a way. So what can we learn from those communities, and how can we actually look at those forms of mobility in the contemporary context?
Oh, that's a big one. But But I think, like I mentioned earlier, for me, those communities represent what we are aspiring to. Yeah. And those are the communities we tend to neglect. Of course, they're doing it in kind of like a haphazard and unregulated way. But I think it's it also exposes the fallacy of these borders for some of us. Really, it does not make sense for some of the countries that we have families that are split across borders, a bit like East and West Germany as it was then. So I think that is where we need to learn the lesson from. Yeah, what is it that we want to get through the free movement? And of course, there are oppositions to free movement, because some people are saying you will open the borders up to, say, laborers from Kenya to come and take their jobs in in our country and that sort of thing. But if you have pastoralists that have been moving willy-nilly across borders all these years, and there has never been really a threat, of course, there is always the threat of rustling each other's cattle. But I mean, in terms of the broader political rights, there is really no issue there at stake. So I think it is something that can be a lesson for allaying some of these fears that we have when we do open the borders. It has been happening and it's always happened. So we shouldn't kind of like blow it out of proportion that when we do open them up, there will be an avalanche. Of course, you can tell I'm an open borders person, but that is my view, really.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I think that this has been a fascinating session where we have just opened the box of the linkages between citizenship, migration, and mobilities. And I hope that I have not troubled way too much our speakers with the big questions, which I think all of us have to and have had to address. The session of the webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on the GLOBALCIT website. So please feel free to share it as a teaching and learning resource. And we will see you and welcome you again on the 25th of May for our webinar convened by our co-director Joshua on territorial rescaling. So thank you again to all of the speakers and everyone who participated in the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.